Okay, everybody, welcome back. So in this section, we're going to start to talk about some of the other pieces of analog hardware or plug-in emulations and how we can add that to our mix and how I kind of think about that. So let's kind of take a step back for a second and kind of just talk about quickly, what did we do up to this point? So what we did up to this point, as you can see on the screen here, we added the first three plugins in our insert chain to build the foundation of our analog studio, right? We started off with a tape machine, and then we moved over to console emulation, and then we also have our channel strip, which replicates the old console in our studio, and in this case we're using an SSL. So now the next step is to talk about, okay, well, in a real analog studio, not only would you have the big analog desk and you'll have a tape machine, you'll also have racks of outboard gear, and depending on what studio you're working in will depend on how much outboard gear they have, and it's usually filled with things like EQs and compressors, which is what we're going to talk about in the next couple of sections here. So in order for me to now kind of continue to follow the process of a real analog studio, as I know in my analog studio I'm going to have some racks of outboard gear, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to now kind of visualize, well, what do I have there that I can use at my disposal? I might have things like, because we're going to talk about EQs in this section, we may have a couple of Pultec EQs, we may have a couple of API EQs, we may have an outboard SSL EQ, we may have a Neve EQ, an outboard Neve EQ. And we can choose to use these, if we choose to, across certain tracks in our mix to add a different flavor and a different spice to make it sound a little bit more unique from everything else in the mix. So I'm going to explain in detail what that means if you're a little confused. But the first thing I like to do is I like to get myself out, and I do this with every mix, and I urge you to do the same thing, is we have to decide, well, what kind of outboard gear are we going to have in our virtual analog studio here? So for this example, I'm going to say, okay, if I was in a fairly, high-end analog studio, I would probably have a couple of Pultec EQs. So I'm going to write down on my piece of paper in front of me on my desk here, 2 Pultec EQs. Okay, then I'm also going to say, well, I'm also probably going to have some kind of a Neve EQ, maybe one outboard Neve EQ. And I happen to have a Neve EQ, which I'll show you in a few minutes. So I'm going to write down, we're going to have one Neve EQ, which in this case will be the Schoeps 1073 by Waves. Okay, and then I might also have a couple of, SSL EQs, some outboard SSL EQs, or an API EQ, and I'm going to write that down on my piece of paper as well. So I'm going to allow myself, and what I'm trying to show you here is I'm going to allow myself in my mix to have 4 pieces of outboard gear for EQs, 2 Pultecs, an SSL, a Neve, and that's it. 2 Pultecs, an SSL, and a Neve. So 4 EQs. So I write that down on my piece of paper in front of me. Okay. Now I just happen to have all those plugins. So we're going to look at those in a second. So let me show you what I mean. So we said we're going to have 2 Pultecs, right? So if I take a look at my universal audio plugins, and I also have them by Waves, and you may want to take a look at these as well. So if you have universal audio, you would have access to, or could have access to, the Pultec EQ, and here happens to be one of them. We'll drop it out here on the bass track for a second. So here is the universal audio Pultec EQP1 AEQ, amazing EQ, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in a second. Okay, so we're going to say in my virtual analog studio that we have 2 of these that we can use anywhere in our mix. Okay, now we only have 2 of these. We can't put this on every single track in our mix, and I'll explain why in a second. So we have 2 Pultecs, so just write yourself a note. 2 Pultec EQs. If you don't have universal audio and you want a great alternative, you can also take a look at the Waves Pultec, which is called the Puig Tech, the Jack Joseph Puig collection here. And let me pull that up so you can just take a look at what that one looks like. Okay, so here is the Waves version of that same plugin. Okay, and they're both fantastic. I tend to use the universal audio ones a little bit more because I'm just used to them. However, you can get the Puig Tech by Waves, and it's just as good. Okay, so we have 2 Pultec EQs that we have in our disposal. We also said we're going to allow ourselves, let's say, a Neve outboard EQ, and we're going to allow ourselves 1 Neve outboard EQ. So you can take a look at, let's see, the Neve. I happen to have the Waves Schoeps 1073, which is a Neve EQ. I'll show you what that looks like here. Again, this is another great plugin. You can get this at wave.com. So here's our Neve style EQ. So we're going to say we can have 1 of those in our virtual analog studio. Okay, and then we also said we're going to allow ourselves, let's say, an SSL outboard EQ. Okay, I have a couple. I have one by Waves, which is part of the SSL bundle, which looks like this. Okay. Or you can also check out, if you don't have any of the Wave stuff, if you want to have another alternative, you could take a look at the Slate Digital collection. If you have the VMR, the virtual mix rack, I'll show you that here. So, well, we've been looking at it the whole time, but let me put another instance of that up here. Just scroll through my plugins. So if we come over to Slate Digital and we come down to the VMR will also allow you to have a Neve and an SSL in this collection. So you can see here is the Neve and here is the SSL. Okay, so you can take a look at the Waves, SHEP 73 or the SSL, or if you don't have that, or if you don't have the SSL bundle, if you have the VMR by Slate Digital, you have a Neve and you have an SSL at your disposal. So those are our 4 EQs that we have if we choose to use them. Now, let me take a step back and let me explain something I mentioned a few minutes ago. So now the beauty of being in the digital world and the beauty of having all of these spectacular sounding analog style plugins, for example, the Universal Audio Pultec here, is that it sounds amazing pretty much on whenever you put it on, and we'll listen to it in a couple of seconds. But what's so great about the digital world is that once you have the plugin, you could put this on as many tracks as you want. So if it sounds great on vocals, you could put it on vocals, you could put it on guitars, you could put it on bass, you could put it on snare. It sounds great anywhere, this Pultec EQ. The reason why I said we only have 2 of them is I'm only going to allow myself to use 2 instances of this if I choose to use it at all. And the reason why I'm doing that, and the reason why I'm not putting it across all the tracks is, in this particular case, the Pultec has a really unique sound to it. And as I said a few minutes ago, it sounds great on anything you put it on. And if you put it, and it has such a unique sound that is why it is so sought after. So in our virtual analog studio, we only allow ourselves 2 of these because that's all you really would have had in a real analog studio, if you even had to. Most analog studios, unless it was a high-end studio, only had 1 of these. This was an expensive piece of gear to have. But for our example, we're going to say we're going to allow ourselves 2 of these. So if you were in a real analog studio and you had 2 Pultecs, you had to decide out of all your tracks, let's say you had a 40-track session, well, what 2 tracks do I want to put this Pultec on? Because I only have 2. I don't have 40 of them, and I can't put them across 40 tracks in an analog studio on a real SSL because we don't have that many. We only have 2. So engineers would have to decide, well, where do I want to put this? A lot of times it would be reserved for things like the lead vocal. The most important instrument in the band is typically the lead vocal. So if you save this to put this on the lead vocal, what this is going to do, it's going to give a little extra flavor, a little bit of a unique sound from an EQ perspective that is different from everything else in the mix. Why? Because everything else in the mix up till this point, if you remember, we were using the EQ right on the channel strip. And that's what you would have done in an analog studio. You would have EQ'd everything on your SSL. And then when you got to the vocal, you may say, you know what, I'm not going to EQ it on the SSL, because the SSL EQ is going to sound the same across all the other tracks. Maybe I'm going to use the Pultec. Why? Because the Pultec sounds different than the SSL, and it's going to give it a little bit of a unique sound, a little bit of a special sound. Okay, and that's how you think in an analog studio. And it's the same thing with compressors, which we'll talk about in the next section. So by you limiting yourself in your digital audio workstation and not falling into the trap to say, well, I have this great Pultec EQ. It sounds amazing on anything I put it on, and I'm going to put it on all my tracks. Then what ends up happening is that vocal track now loses all of its uniqueness. It sounds great, but if you put it on the vocal, the bass, the guitars, the snare, the kick drum, the toms, the overheads, now all of your tracks have that Pultec flavor to it, and the vocal doesn't stand out as much anymore. Make sense? So again, we're always trying to constantly think about our digital audio workstation like a real analog studio. And up to this point, we really haven't had any limitations. Here's where you have to have some discipline and be restrained from taking this Pultec and spreading it across all of your tracks, because that is going to ruin, in some respects, that analog vibe. And that's not how these old school records were made. You had 2 in the studio. You had to pick the 2 tracks that you were going to spice it up with the Pultec EQ. Okay, now because we said we had a couple of Pultecs, we also have a Neve EQ. So if we have 4 different outboard EQs, we can use 4 different outboard EQs across our tracks and not use the EQ that was on the channel strip. That's okay. It doesn't mean you have to use all 4. You may only want to use 1 or 2, but I limit myself to no more than 4 outboard EQs. And the ones that we're talking about now are pretty much the ones that I always limit myself to. It's a couple of Pultecs. It's a Neve of some kind. It's an SSL of some kind. Those are generally the ones that I'll use. Now, if I'm using an SSL channel strip, well, then I don't. If I have an SSL outboard EQ, it's the same thing. So if I was using a Neve channel strip, I may allow myself the SSL outboard gear. Okay. If I'm on an SSL, I might allow myself the Neve. Okay. Just to make sense. So for EQs, you know, you tend to have fewer choices, which is fine. When we get to compressors, that's a whole different story. So again, make sure that when you're looking at these analog EQs, and these are the ones that I would recommend you take a look at if you don't have any separate EQs in the analog plug-in world, is that make sure you limit yourself to no more than 4, and you don't want to spread them all across all the tracks, because again, it loses its uniqueness. That's the whole trick to this analog, these extra outboard pieces of gear. Okay, so let's just take a quick listen to something like, let's take a listen to our snare drum here. Let's loop a section here. Okay, so here's our snare. And I will go ahead and I'll turn this up just a little bit so you can hear it. Okay, now let's drop this Pultec on the snare, just to give you guys an idea of what this kind of sounds like. Right now it's in the off position. So now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up our SSL, and I'm going to bypass our EQ. Okay, because we don't want to double EQ it. There's really no reason to do that. In some instances there might be, but in this example we're going to bypass it. Okay, we're not going to use the SSL EQ. We're going to use the Pultec instead. So now what's great about the Pultec, and let me explain the layout of this EQ. This is a tube-based EQ. And a tube-based EQ is going to have a much more nice, warm, not real harsh top end, and it's going to have a nice kind of a creamy, smooth, low, and mid-range. Okay, and that's why this EQ in the hardware form is so sought after, because as I said earlier, anything you put through it pretty much sounds good. It's hard to make something sound bad. So let me show you how this kind of works. Now, in the Universal Audio version, as well as the Waves version, they also not only modeled the EQ section, which we'll walk through the controls here in a second, but they also modeled the input transformer and the output transformer of the EQ, which is what gives it its sound, more so than the EQ section. Okay, so it's super important. That's why this thing sounds so colorful. So if we look at here, we have a toggle switch here on the left, in and out. This is putting in or out the actual input transformer. So you can bypass the input transformer and not have that part of the modeling and just hit the EQ, or you can have the input transformer in. I always leave it in, because why would you take it out? At least that's, you know, it's just got a different tone to it. Again, over here we have our low frequency selector. We have 20 Hertz, 30, 60, and 100. So this is a predetermined fixed set of frequency ranges, okay? So again, you got some limitations, a little more limitations than what you had on the actual channel strip itself. This low frequency selector works with this boost. You can boost. So if you have it on, say, 30 Hertz, this will boost it, the 30 Hertz range. This will attenuate it or cut it at 30 Hertz. Now, what also is special about the Pultec is that it's the only EQ in hardware form where you can actually boost and cut that frequency, in this case 100 Hertz, at the same time. And you might be saying to yourself, well, how is that possible? Either you boost or you cut it. Well, on this particular EQ, it does when you boost it, and then you actually cut it a little bit, it does a funny thing to the boost in the way it shapes it. It's hard to explain, but it has a very unique sound to it, and that's why engineers love it, because it's the sound of the Pultec that you don't get anywhere else. So by playing with the boost and the cut together, you can get some nice, interesting sound. So that's one of the reasons why, excuse me, especially on things like bass guitar. I highly recommend that you have a Pultec style EQ in your collection, because you have something special you can do to the low end that you can't do in any other EQ. No other EQ can you boost and cut the same frequency at the same time, right? So that's how those three knobs work together. Over here in the center, we have this thing called bandwidth. This is the adjustable Q for the high frequency selector, which is here. This starts at 3K, 4K, 5K, 8K, 10, 12, and 16K, okay? And here's the adjustable. The sharp will be a much more narrow Q, and then as you bring it up to broad, it'll have a much more gentle, wide curve, okay? Typically, I leave it somewhere in the middle, most times. This high frequency works along with this boost, okay? So again, if I'm at 5K and I turn it up to 7, I'm boosting 7 dB at 5K. Okay, the attenuator does not work with the high frequency selector like it does with the low frequency selector. Some people get confused by that. They think this attenuation is cutting at 5K. That's not true. It only has a boost. Okay, and this is true to the hardware. The attenuator is for this over here, 5, 10, or 20, this attenuation selection. So if you want to boost at 5K, you can, and then you can also put this on 5K and attenuate, and again, you get some kind of a weird kind of a thing happening, which gives it a little bit of a unique sound. Or you can boost at 5K, and then at 10K, you can cut. So this attenuation or cut works with this attenuation selector, okay? And then over here, you just shut the plugin on and off here by turning it here. Okay, that's how this plugin works. So it's very simple to use. So now if we play back our snare, or actually the best thing to probably, well, we'll start with snare, then we'll move to like the overheads. So here's the snare. So let's say like 100 Hertz. You get a little more weight to it. Make sure this is not clipping too much on you guys. Okay, and then if we attenuate it as well, hear that? How you don't lose all the bottom end, but it gets a little warmer sounding. Now let's say like say around 3K, if we wanted to boost a little, can really bring some crack out. I want to bring it some of the real high snap at 10K. Okay, and if I turn it off, that's what we started with. Adds a little more weight, a little bit of crack. Okay, so now that sound, let's pin this for a second, and let's bring up the SSL that we originally EQ'd this with, just so you can hear the difference between the two. And again, this is something that you really have to kind of experiment with once you get yourself some of these plugins. So here is the, okay, we're gonna move this over here. We're going to turn off the Pultec, and we're just gonna turn on the EQ here. Okay, that's the SSL EQ. How we originally EQ'd it. Okay, now if I shut that off and turn this on, see how much different that sounds? Now we got a little bit of a boost here at 100. So there is the EQ on the SSL. If I boost at 100 here, shut that off. Back to the SSL. Okay, so hopefully you can hear there. We dialed it in pretty close together. How they just tonally have a much different tone. The Pultec tends to have a little bit more depth and a little bit more openness to it, okay? It sounds a little bit more full and thick. The same boost at 100 Hertz on the SSL isn't as thick sounding, Okay, it sounds a little bit thinner, a little bit weaker than the Pultec. So again, the point is that you cannot use this on the SSL. You can use the Pultec as opposed to the SSL EQ. You can still compress and do all your filtering. Use your Pultec and you can get a different sound that's going to sound tonally and EQ wise different than all the other drums if you just use it on the snare and the drum kit. Okay, all the other drums have the SSL EQ. This has the Pultec. So you get a little bit of a different sound. Okay, so that's what the Pultec sounds like on, let's say, a snare. Let's leave that up there for now. Now let's just try overheads where you can hear the entire drum kit. So now again, the overheads are a stereo track. Yes, they're a stereo track. So we want to make sure with all these plugins that we make sure we use the stereo instance of this. Like we did with the channel strip. So let's get the Pultec and let's get the stereo version. Again, Waves and Universal Audio have mono and stereo versions where a lot of other plugin companies, it kind of knows regardless. You drop it on a track and it does something behind the scenes to adjust for it. You don't have two separate plugins. So let's get the Pultec here, and let's get the stereo version of it. And here is the stereo version of the Pultec. Now, once again, let's shut it off on the SSL. Well, let's listen to what the overheads sound like with the SSL. And then we will we'll turn off the Pultec here for a second. Okay, let's just listen to the SSL. Probably should get something where we have some kick drum happening, right? Hold on here. Okay, there's our overheads. Okay. So here's our EQ that we did here. That's before. After. Okay, so here we boosted up about, what, 2 dB at 10K, and we rolled off a little bit at around 400 to get rid of some of the boxiness. Now, if we were to shut that off and we were to pull in the Pultec here, turn this on. Okay, now let's say we want to get a little bit more crispiness on this, around 10K. You can almost push it as much as you want. It never sounds bad. Now, we don't have anywhere to cut out that 400 hertz. We don't have that on this EQ. So again, this is some of the limitations. You're not really going to be able to do much there as far as that goes, but you can boost maybe a little bit at 100. That's before. After. So I bypass this and go back to the SSL. Okay, so here, where we rolled off a little bit at 400 hertz to get rid of some of that mid-range boxiness, we don't have that adjustment on the SSL. So maybe you want to, this may be a case where it's like, okay, maybe I want the top end from the SSL. But we want to roll, from the Pultec, but we just want to cut out that mid-range on this EQ. So maybe you would leave this EQ in for your cut, and then you would use the Pultec for your boost. See what I mean? That's before. After. Okay, so the point is, once again, that we have, and if we bring all the drums back into the mix here, just so you can hear what we got going on with all the drums. We'll turn this down a little bit. That's before. This is just on the overheads now with the whole drum kit. Listen to the snare. So you can hear, hopefully, if you're listening to this and watching this, or listening to this on a good set of cans or studio monitors, you can hear that the top end just opens up a little bit from this little boosted 10K, but it never sounds EQ'd. And that's the point I want to make about the Pultec and why I recommend you have one in your collection. No matter how much you push this EQ, it never sounds like it's processed. It always sounds like it's natural. That's not the case with a lot of EQs, whether they're analog style plugins or not. So that's why this EQ is really important. Okay, so kind of again, the point being with this section is that we have our outboard gear. Okay, we have our 4 EQs if we want to use them, and we have to pick through our tracks, where do we want things to stand out? Where do we want things to have a little bit special tonality to it? I typically will look at things like overheads, like the snare for the drum kit, toms, kick, room mics. Usually I'll just settle on whatever's on the channel strip is just fine. But if it's like a hard rock track or something where the snare, you really want that snare to kind of crack through and give it a little bit more punch, I'll use something like the Pultec. Where on the let's turn that on here. Okay, where on the overhead. So usually like snare in overheads, maybe on drums. I might use the Pultec on something like a lead vocal especially. We didn't process lead vocals in this example, but you'll see me do that in the mixing section of this series where we actually mix this song. We'll use a different EQ on the vocals for sure to give it a little bit of that extra spice to punch it through the mix. And that would really be it. That's usually where I stick with the Pultec. Again, I only allow myself 2, so I'd probably put like 1 maybe on the snare, 1 on the vocal, or 1 on the overheads, 1 on the vocal. Or sometimes if the drums sound great by themselves, I might do it on the electric guitars in the vocal. It's usually, and a lot of times, I don't even use 2 instances of it. I'll just use 1, and more times than not, I'll use it on the vocal. Or maybe on the lead vocal, and then on the background vocal bus, I might put a little bit of Pultec on there as well. Okay? So that's kind of how I think about the EQs as far as outboard gear goes. And again, once again, say it again, you want to make sure that you're thinking about, write it down on a piece of paper like I do. I put it right in front of me. I use my EQs and my compressors. What EQs am I going to allow myself in my virtual analog studio? What compressors am I going to allow myself, which we're going to look at in the next section. We're going to compare some of them together so you can kind of hear the differences. They all sound a little bit different from each other. And again, this series is not intended to demo every single one of these like the Sheps or like the SSL, because a lot of these plugins, even if you don't already own them, you could go out and demo them for free for usually a week to 14 days. And I want you to go out and do that. I'm not going to demo every one of these for you. You'll see me use some of these in the mixing part of this series, but with the exception of Universal Audio, all the other plugins that I'm showing you, you can demo for free. So go check them out. And I would recommend that you have a Pultec style EQ in your collection. Again, if you don't have Universal Audio, which is this one here, go out and check out the Puig Tech by Waves. Again, this sounds nearly identical to the Universal Audio one, and again, it looks a little different, but it's laid out exactly the same with the controls here. Everything is exactly the same. The only difference is here on the Waves version, you have this 50-60 cycle hum, the added noise that they put in, which is something that usually happens on all the Waves plugins. And you have a gain knob that if you're boosting up some frequencies, you can turn down the gain to compensate and level match the plugin, which is kind of a nice feature that you don't have on the original hardware. So they added that to their plugin, which is pretty cool. But go out and demo them. So you want to have a Pultec, and then as far as what else do you want to have, again, another great choice would be a Neve and an SSL. And if you get the virtual mix rack collection from Slate, if you don't already have it, you get a Neve and you get an SSL, 2 plugins inside of this virtual mix rack bundle, as well as other things. You also get other EQs like this custom series EQ by Slate, and you get something called the custom custom series lift, which is a parallel style EQ. So the Slate is a real nice affordable way to get yourself a bunch of EQs. If you get the Slate virtual mix rack, you're going to get 4 EQs in that plugin. And then if you get yourself the Pultec, one of the Pultec style, you'll have 5 outboard EQs. And again, I only limit myself to 4. You can limit yourself to 5. You can limit yourself to 2 and just use your channel strip for most of your EQ and only have a couple. But again, last time I'll say it, the point is you don't want to have 15 of them and put 15 different style EQs across your entire mix, because things are going to start to sound disjointed. The majority of your EQing on most of your tracks comes from your channel strip. Okay, the majority of compression across most of your tracks is going to come from your channel strip. These are what I call a little extra spice to the sauce. We're going to sprinkle in a little EQ to make something sound unique and special. In the next section, we're going to sprinkle in a little compression on a couple of these different tracks to make things sound special and unique and give it a more interesting feel. But don't confuse that in this example, we're trying to keep this mix sounding like an SSL mix. So the majority of the lifting is going to be done by the channel strip. Okay, so go, download some of these demos, check them out, put them on in different instances. And when we get to the mixing series, as I said, you're going to see me use these different things and how I kind of sprinkle them around. But that is kind of the philosophy on the hardware EQs. So come back to the next section in a few minutes, and we're going to discuss the same philosophy around compressors. And I'm going to show you some different compressors that I have and things that you may want to go and check out and demo for yourself. And we'll be back in a second. Come on back.